All right. So this week I read a book called Decades, which is a biography of Joy Division and New Order. New Order, like we mentioned, being the band that would immediately spawn after Joy Division ended. I also watched a couple decent documentaries on YouTube, specifically a channel called Amplified that had a fan made documentary that was really well done. But the story of Joy Division is full of grit, determination, and of course, sadness and despair. But our story begins in Manchester in the 1950s. So, Joy Division is composed of four lads from Manchester. But before I get into a little bit of their backgrounds, I want to talk a bit about Manchester, like Andrew mentioned. So, we've heard in other episodes, Manchester, the city, is almost as much a part of the story of other bands as it is this band. And it really informed their worldview and their attitudes. And while Manchester did escape most of the bombings from Germany in World War II, it never actually recovered from World War One. It was a factory town, and after the
Jeez.
war, you were still considered wealthy if you had running water. And there was a article written in 1950 of a guy who was describing Manchester and the buildings as only being held together by a coating of grime. And amongst its narrow streets was dirt everywhere and no water to fight it. Now, it really was a backwater back in the day, and that's where our story starts. By the way, you're going to see me do that a lot because I'm dying. All right. Now, despite being the front man and the center of the misery of this story, Ian Curtis was not the founder of the band. So instead, we're going to first talk about Bernard Sumner, who would eventually wind up playing guitar and keys on this album. Now, Bernard was born in January of 1956 in the town of Salford, which is an area just west of Manchester proper. Now, Bernard's is a sad story, too. You'll start to see a theme here. Bernard never knew his father. His mother, Laura, who was already dealing with the stigma of being an unwed mother, also had cerebral palsy and was wheelchair bound. But that didn't stop her from flying into violent fits of rage stemming from
Jeez.
undiagnosed depression.
I
His
mean,
mother,
the depression kind of makes sense.
yeah,
I
right,
gotta
right.
say, it's a pretty tough hand to be dealt.
Is the wheelchair held together by grime as well?
Yeah, seriously. What kind of guy has like a one night stand with a woman in a wheelchair and bounces on her to leave her to raise the child by herself? That is not a quality person.
It's world class
Adam might need to
deadbeat.
explore that timeline a little bit more to see when the wheelchair actually comes into play, though, right?
Right.
Is this a lifelong
Yeah, you're
thing?
right. I don't know. Right. It might have been down anyway. So his mother eventually does marry another guy named Jim Dickon, who is also disabled, and they all live with Laura's parents, who are blind. So from
You
a
are
young
making this up, right?
I am not. So from a young age, Bernard is basically a caretaker for four adults.
This
Jeez.
is
Four
a Dickens
disabled
novel.
adults. I know.
Like,
Now, Bernard is not a particularly musical kid, but he did excel in school. In fact, he makes it into grammar school. And just as a reminder of the British education system, when you reach high school age, you either went to secondary modern school, which was aimed at more manual workforce jobs, or you went to grammar school, which was the gateway to better paying, cushier jobs. So on his first day at grammar school, he meets a kid named Peter Hook, aka Hooky, the eventual bass player in this band. Hooky was also born in Salford in February of 1956. Both of those guys make it through grammar school, though Hooky admitted that they were, quote, the scum at the back of the class. So right off the bat, I feel he had a little bit of a chip on his shoulder from where they came from. And you can kind of see that progress through the story, as we'll see. All right, so the two graduate, and this is when music starts to play a bigger role in their lives. Bernard said that he initially got into music because of Ennio Morricone's spaghetti western soundtracks, which is pretty cool.
Those are
But
great, by the way.
right? Yeah. In fact, Rob, you were the one who turned me on to that. So yeah, good stuff. So the duo starts hanging out this place called Pips, where they were exposed to David Bowie and bands like Roxy Music. And they're both working menial jobs at this point. Hooky worked in a kitchen. Bernard was a runner at random jobs in and around Salford. Standard stuff here. But then on June 4th, 1976, something special happens. This specific event has been mentioned many times on this podcast because it seems that everyone who attended the show went off and started a successful band. That is the famous Sex Pistols show at the Lesser Free Trade Hall in Manchester that spawned a ton of bands, including the Smiths and the Fall and Joy Division. So both Peter Hook and Bernard Dicken were there. Bernard noted that it was inspiring because the Sex Pistols were, quote, just a bunch of working class twats like us. So the show, though, was not some masterpiece. The Sex Pistols basically just played a bunch of covers. The Who, the Stooges, Small Faces, but it was their DIY aesthetic that stood out and inspired Hooky and Bernard. So the next morning, Hooky goes out and buys himself a bass guitar with some cash that he borrowed from his mom. Bernard bought a guitar, and their friend at the time, Terry Mason, bought a drum kit. All right, next up, brace yourself. They start practicing. Very unpunk. Not punk at all.
That's the
They're
post-punk
already-
apps. Post-punk, you actually practice.
Exactly. Punk had already died after that Sex Pistols show. It basically was dying.
True. It was only alive for the 45-minute set duration.
It does seem that the more we explore punk, the window continues to close. It's 5 years. It's 3 years. It was 17 months. What?
And
Given
45
that
minutes for a punk set is very, very generous, by the way. That seems very padded.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I was thinking of all the time they had to receive the crowd's spit.
Right.
Sure. Taking breaks in between songs to tune their instruments.
So the Sex Pistols come back to Manchester again about a month and a half later. Bernard and Hooky are there again, but also in the crowd this time is a kid named Ian Curtis, but they don't all meet up yet. So Bernard decides that they need to keep this little proto band progressing. So he puts an ad in the window of the Virgin Record store in Manchester for a vocalist. Ian Curtis responds to the ad via a phone call, and he and Bernard talk a bunch, and Ian tells Bernard of his love for the Stooges and Velvet Underground, and Ian gets the job sight unseen. Or
So-
should I say, sound unheard.
Probably was a plus for Ian.
Right, yeah, that's...
Shots fired.
I did see an anecdote that at that show that they went to where Ian Curtis was there, they didn't really talk to him, but they noticed him in the crowd because he had on a black leather jacket that just had the word hate written across it in like neon orange or something like that. And they were like, that's a cool jacket. I want to know that guy.
Well, this is tangential, but I always heard that story. It reminds me of the story of Malcolm McLaren discovering Johnny Rotten, the lead singer of the Sex Pistols. He just picked him off of the streets of London because he had a Pink Floyd t-shirt on, but he had scribbled "I hate" over top of it. And he was like, this is the guy to front my band.
This is my guy.
That's all you need. So the initial iteration of this band gets together. They start rehearsing in a room above a pub in Salford. And even though Ian hates all other bands just on principle, he introduces himself to Pete Shelley, the founder of the Buzzcocks, who are a punk band from Manchester. And he's hoping to ingratiate himself with a known group, also get some advice, and just expose himself to the scene. So Ian cared. Again, very unpunk. He's trying to get his way into the scene and meet people. So good for you, Ian.
Well, didn't he also have like a wife and kid to support at this point in his life?
Not yet. Not yet.
Not yet.
Yeah,
Okay.
that
Not
came
quite
later.
yet. Okay.
He does get married pretty young.
He had a lady friend who I think was like his high school sweetheart, but they were
special
not
lady.
married or had kids yet.
Okay.
So that's perfect. A little background on Ian Curtis. He was also born in 1956, but he grew up in a more bucolic area about 30 miles from Manchester. Ian was a notoriously shy kid, but also super smart and super into music, obsessed with music. So much so that he drops out of St. John's College, which is now Manchester College, to take a job at an elite record store in Manchester called Rare. But apparently he isn't music obsessed enough to actually keep that job for very long, which is actually a pretty punk move. So he's going back and forth, man. I don't know what he is. Is he punk? Is he post-punk? So he bounces around to various jobs and winds up at a local job center in Macclesfield. That's the town where he grew up outside of Manchester, where he assisted disabled people, helped them find jobs. It sounded like he was kind of a social worker, kind of a mix of helping people get back on their feet. Now, here we go. Ian gets married at the tender age of 19 to a girl named Deborah, who was 18 at the time. All right, back to the band. It's March of 1977. The band is practicing and gigging, but also burning through a bunch of drummers at the end, and they have yet to settle on a name. They were considering Stiff Kittens, which was a suggestion from the Buzzcocks, but
Kinda punk.
instead, yeah, it's pretty punk. But instead went with a reference to a David Bowie song, Warsaw. which is on Bowie's 1977 album Low. Now, they play their first gig as Warsaw in May of 1977. Now, the band is playing around a bit, but they're struggling to find the right fit when it comes to a drummer. And they do have
Hold
a
on,
very...
before we get past this is one of the things in my research that absolutely blew my mind. They got national press coverage of that first show that they played as Warsaw. How the hell does that happen? How do you get the national press to write about your first show? It doesn't sound like they had connections or anything like that. I really want to know how that happened so I could try to replicate it, because it's never happened for me ever.
I don't have any details on that, but that's a great question.
Right place, right time. I mean,
I
like
guess,
every
but
YouTuber.
who's just
Today.
going to like a 40-person show at a small club and being like, oh, you know what? I'm like the writer for the, I don't know, London Gazette or whatever the fuck. I'm just going to write, or NME or something. I'm just going to write an article about this band.
Well, maybe it was just that time where people were looking to jump on the bandwagon. They could tell something musical was happening.
Right. All right, so they're playing around a bit, but they're struggling to find the right fit with the drummer, and they have a super unique way of firing drummers, which I think is pretty epic. One of their early drummers got drunk at a show, stumbled his way to the front of the stage, made an ass out of himself, and on the drive home, the band stops the van, asks him to get out and check if they had a flat, and then drove away.
Wow. Call that
That's
the
like some
Manchester
Megadeth
exit.
stuff.
The Manchester
These
exit.
guys aren't post-punk. They are gangsters.
Yeah, seriously.
My
I mean,
God.
that's call for a murdering, you know? You're just like out on some country road 30 miles from anywhere. Good Lord.
Yeah.
All right. Now, during all of this, they're still trying to find their identity as a band as well. Ian is trying to figure out what he wants to be as a showman, as a frontman, as a frontman, and just as an example, trying to play around, he smashed a glass on stage one time and crawled across the shards like Iggy Pop and was just bleeding all over the place. Now that is showmanship. Now, Ian, they're down a drummer.
That's one word for it.
Yeah. Also pretty hard to replicate that every night. If you're doing that.
It's
A lot of
WWF,
medical, socialized medicine, baby.
right?
Yeah. Good point. Good point.
Just alternate crawling your back and your front every other night. So Ian places an ad for a drummer, and Stephen Morris answers the call. Stephen, it turns out, attended the same school as Ian. So just a quick review here. The band is Bernard Sumner on guitar. He was 21. Peter Hook on bass at 21. Ian Curtis was 21. He was on vocals, and Stephen Morris on drums at 20 years old. So on December 14th of 1977, the band, who was Warsaw at this point, go into the studio to record 4 songs for an EP called An Ideal for Living. So I want to go ahead and drop in a clip of a song from that EP. This is called Leaders of Men. Super thrashy, super punk, almost unidentifiable as the band that produces tonight's album, I thought.
Is this the one where their manager was the one who was producing it and had the TV playing while they were playing, and it actually shows up on some of the tracks? I know they fired one of their managers because like it might have been their demos, but they were like handing out their demos to try to get shows, and the theme song for a TV show was like playing over part of it. And then at one point, the
I
guy's
missed
mom
that.
comes in and like asks him if he wants some tea, and it's all on the track.
That must have been one of these unreleased demos or something. Because I definitely didn't hear that in the Ideal for Living, but that's hilarious.
Listen, it's art. If you can define it, you're probably doing it wrong.
He's taking bold choices.
Yeah. Well, I think also Leaders of Men sounds like what I think like that more kind of focused, refined punk sound they were probably looking for, instead of what ended up coming out of this album that we're talking about, you know, with the Hannett influence stuff. If they had gone in a different direction, different producer, who knows what would have happened.
Yeah, it's funny because when Adam, you put that on the playlist and I listened to it, I was like, oh, this I can actually get down with. But then I was like, you know, we wouldn't be talking about this album if this was the product of it.
Exactly.
So.
Absolutely.
Right.
Agreed. Yeah.
All right. Now, the name Warsaw is pretty cool, but at the time, there was another band, specifically a West London punk band called Warsaw Pact, who had already released an album just a month before Warsaw went into the studio for that EP. And the problem was that Warsaw Pact was on a major label, and major labels have lawyers. So their last gig as Warsaw is on New Year's Eve of 1977. And in January of 1978, they're looking for new band names. And so some quick trivia here for you guys. Which of the following was not considered in their search for a new name? Slaves of Venus, the Mancunian Masochists, Boys in Bondage.
I'm gonna go Slaves of Venus.
I'm gonna go the Mancunian Masochists.
Yeah, that's my guess. That just sounds too not.
That's correct. Yeah, that was made up by me. But Slaves of Venus and Boys in Bondage were all potential band names after they got rid of Warsaw.
Does anyone else find it interesting they named themselves after a city? They must have been aware of Chicago, Boston, Kansas. I feel like there's a vibe with bands that take on city names, right?
Yeah.
They were rebelling against all of those 70s bands, right?
Yeah.
Subverting your expectations, Rob. Yeah, definitely.
I doubt they were Boston fans. That's what I'm trying to say.
Kansas fans, they were probably a big fan of.
Chicago had too many horns. There's no
they
way.
were like huge Bowie fans and Iggy Pop fans. I mean, Boston is not. It's not of the polar opposite of those sounds.
I think it's pretty far away, to be honest. I mean, or at least in how they were.
I'll say it's somewhere in the middle. It's a day's drive. I'll say that.
All right, now around this time, Ian is reading a book called House of Dolls by a former Auschwitz survivor named Yehiel Denur. And in that book, the author describes something called joy divisions. Again, everybody in the world knows this except me, but I'm going to say it anyway. All right, so these things called joy divisions, which were brothels set up by Nazis that forced Jewish women into sexual slavery, essentially rape camps in the Warsaw ghettos. And like any sane person thinks, well, this is our new name. So they go with Joy Division.
It's a good name. To be fair,
it is a good sounding name. It's memorable and it's provocative, which I'm sure they liked.
Right. And in line with some of that Nazi stuff, a lot of people talk about the Nazi leanings. And I honestly don't think these guys were Nazis or even sympathetic to the cause. I think they were just young and stupid and trying to freak out the squares. But they did have a series of unfortunate decisions that led people to believe the Nazi things. So
we had talked about this in the Susie Sue episode where she used to like walk around with a swastika armband. I think it was just kind of in the youth culture rebelling at the time. And that's what's going to piss off your parents' generations because they literally just fought and died trying to kill the Nazis. And so they're like, what's the most offensive thing I can do? Oh, I'll wear a swastika, not thinking about the larger ramifications of that.
Again, pre-internet. This will never come back to haunt us.
Yeah. A lot of punk is pretty short-sighted, let's be honest.
17-month view, that's it. And I think one of the guys from MC5, I think, did the same thing. I forget which episode. It was one of the episodes with Conan Neutron where we talked about one of the band members on stage would wear Nazi gear and have memorabilia and stuff. But
must have been Stooges.
Yeah, that's probably it. So that EP that they recorded in 1977, An Ideal for Living, is released in June of 1978, almost 6 months after they started the recording process. And it was released under the name Joy Division. So they released it on a 7-inch vinyl record. And this was something odd that I saw in an interview with, I guess, one of the roadies or somebody who helped them out at that time. And that they put the EP on a 7-inch record and that somehow that compressed the sound. So they hated the 7-inch pressing because it sounded like the entire band was underwater. So after they had sold a couple thousand of those, they had it reprinted on a 12-inch vinyl, but only 4 songs. And apparently that opened up the sound a lot more and you could hear things a bit better. But I didn't realize that compression was an issue in a vinyl.
The closer the grooves are, the less information you're going to be able to get and the less movement you're going to get of the needle, right? So that's why there are limits to the amount of time you can put on any record. You can theoretically keep putting grooves in it up to a point, but you're going to get lower and lower quality at least. I don't know if that's actually compression, technically.
I got it. Yeah, because I would have assumed that 4 punk songs would have fit on 2 sides of a 7-inch vinyl. So I don't know what they were doing, or maybe the
I think
vinyl
it-
shop
I-
that they went to was just a startup.
good-
I don't know.
I think it's like 7 minutes ish if you're playing it at 33.
Okay, all right. So maybe that was a little compressed there.
But honestly, 12-inch with 4 songs, you could have put a wheelbarrow in those grooves. If you released this, you know?
All right. So with their EP released and re-released on 12-inch, they are gigging, they're writing, rehearsing, and very shortly thereafter, they take on a manager named Rob Gretton. All right. So it's September of 1978. And remember, they've now changed their name. So Joy Division makes their debut television appearance on a show called So It Goes. They are introduced by a TV personality named Tony Wilson. And Tony Wilson is a television producer, journalist, and is just known on the scene for promoting Manchester bands, Manchester music. And I'm sure we could have an entire episode on this character, Tony Wilson, but he becomes a fan of Joy Division. And around that same time, he comes into an inheritance and uses that money to start his own label that he called Factory. So the very first Factory record is a sampler that includes 2 tracks from Joy Division. But it only goes on to sell about 5,000 copies. Not terrible. But Joy Division is still trying to find a label who's going to take them on fully. Now, the band is floundering a bit. They really haven't established a large fan base. They're playing a lot of shitty gigs. And that struggle bus continues to plow on when, in late 1978, Ian Curtis has his first epileptic seizure. And if you're unfamiliar with epilepsy, it's a brain disorder that triggers seizures where muscles all over your body just start spasming uncontrollably. It's really scary. And even scarier to see happen to somebody. So his first seizure happens during a band fight in their touring van on the way home from a particularly shitty gig. So he starts seizing up in the van and they drive immediately to a hospital where they just start medicating him like crazy. And again, this is where it kind of continues to get worse. He's instructed to stay on those medications, which were anticonvulsants. And no big surprise, there were a bunch of side effects associated with those medicines as well, not the least of which was unpredictable and violent mood swings. So these medications, though, they only reduce, they don't eliminate the seizures. So the seizures continue to occur more frequently, more violently, and he just starts spinning into a depressive state. No big surprise here.
Quick question, Adam. Did he try essential oils?
Rub some crystals on himself and see if
That's not punk at all.
It's very unpunk.
I think he was also instructed not to stay up late and not to drink. When you're a gigging musician in 1979 in Manchester, like, what else do you do?
Yeah, so like overstimulation was one of the things that would cause them to come on. I don't know if you're going to get into it, but I was learning about his post-gig routine that he had with his wife, where because he had this fear of choking on his own tongue and dying in his sleep because of a seizure, he would go sit down with his wife and they would both stay up either until he had a seizure or until he was able to like tell that one was coming on by the change in the breathing pattern and then, you know, kind of cut it off. And apparently they kept that up through the end of his life, basically.
Holy crap. So he was sleep deprived as well.
Yeah.
So he would basically wait up all night until the seizure happened. And then once it happened, he knew that he could then go to sleep because it wasn't going to happen again. Oh my God. So that's a terrible way to start off 1979, but there are some positive things that are about to happen for the band.
How do you like one of those newscasters who was like, and 14 children were killed
or drowned,
but a puppy in sunglasses is...
Let's go to a clip.
Right. What's happening on the big board behind us? We see that.
That squirrel is water skiing. It's amazing.
So Ian lands on the cover of NME, which is a New Music Express magazine in England, in January of 1979. Now, this despite the fact that all the band members still have day jobs. But Tony Wilson comes back into the picture, and under the Factory label, he offers Joy Division a pretty sweet deal. Factory would front the cost of the album, And after they recouped the costs, they would split earnings 50-50 with the band, and the band would retain artistic control of the project. However, I think it's debatable that the band has artistic control because enter their producer, Martin Hannett. Hannett is in the music business and at the time is working with a recording studio called Strawberry Studios, which is also where today's album is recorded. And that is a perfect spot for our favorite segment, By the Numbers.
Woo!
I have an extended set here, so buckle up, boys. All right, 8,000, as in 8,000 pounds. That's the budget that Factory Records gave the band in 1979 to record this album, which would be about 40,000 US dollars today. All right, next number, 50 pence. That's what it would take to get you into that legendary Sex Pistols show in June of 1976, which would run you about $350.
I don't know. How much did you have to spend on your outfit, though, to get let in?
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a lot. 150. That's the capacity of the Lesser Free Trade Hall where the Sex Pistols held that influential show. But at that show, there were probably only about 40 people there. Morrissey was there as well.
But 7,000 have claimed to be there. Is that your next
Right.
number?
Yeah. Oh, that's
so
a good
39
point.
humans. You mean
Right.
if Morrissey's there, it cuts it
39
down
humans.
a human
Morrissey.
being.
Next number is 400. 400 pounds. That's about how much the band spent out of their own pockets to have that first EP, those 4 songs recorded in Ideal for Living. 19. CP 1919. That's the official name of the radio pulsar star, according to the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Astronomy, whose radio signal visualization was put on the album cover. And in relation to that, 1049. That's the opening bid for an actual authentic vintage 1980 Joy Division t-shirt featuring the cover art from Unknown Pleasures on eBay. It's crazy.
I was waiting for you to say like 5% the amount of people who are wearing that t-shirt on the street that have ever heard this album.
Yeah.
Totally.
So the craziest thing is that the band never officially made t-shirts until like the 2000s. They missed out on all that sweet t-shirt money because they thought it was
right?
like selling out to make
Mhm.
t-shirts. Like, what the fuck?
I dare say this is a prototypical punk show type t-shirt. It's abstract, it's
Mhm.
black, it's
badass,
monochrome. I
yeah.
mean, it's
Yeah.
great. Yeah.
Doesn't have the band or album name on it.
Exactly. Yeah. Why
Oh,
would you want
yeah.
that? Yeah.
So I don't know if this came up in your research, but it might be one of the numbers you want to throw out there, which is 48 hours, which is when I believe it was 2005, Disney put up a version of the Joy Division shirt where Mickey's head was in the logo of the waves. And it lasted for 48 hours before a general outcry from the public forced them to take it down. Because
Wow.
apparently they didn't seek permission to do it or anything like that.
Just
They just
did
had
it.
it up for sale on their site.
That's how you know your design has made it quite far.
Yeah.
And can you think of anything less punk than putting Mickey Mouse
Yeah.
in the waves of that logo?
For Disney adults, too. This is not for kids. This is
Yeah,
for
you're right,
adults
you're right.
who are like all about Disney.
Oh my
Not
God.
punk.
All right, next number is 16. That is the number of songs recorded for this album, and only the 10 best, in air quotes, made the cut. Now, 15,000. That is the number of albums sold of Unknown Pleasures in the first 6 months after its release. It failed to chart. That is until Ian's death, at which point it made it up to 71 in the British charts.
I mean, that's already kind of a lot for how weird this band is, right?
Yeah, 15,000 in 6 months ain't terrible. I'd be
Yeah.
happy with that number.
Sure.
All right. Next number, 0. The number of singles released for this album. Can you imagine that this band wasn't really into releasing singles?
Not really radio conscious. Not a lot of radio edits of these songs that they're releasing.
Right. All right. 1. So a couple days after their TV debut, they played a show in Huddersfield, a town in West Yorkshire, at a place called Kirkwood Rooms, where the audience consisted of one person. Yes, They played a show to one person after being on TV.
Ooh.
Yeah, that's
Well,
rough.
I've done that and I've been on TV.
Right.
So there
I
you
was
go.
gonna say we've all done it. Where's the shame there? Where's the shame?
Yeah. Some of the better shows that we have played in terms of performance have been in front of fucking nobody.
Small crowds, sure.
Right. All right, 13. Here's a dark one for the episode. What does that even mean at this point? 13 is the number of women that the Yorkshire Ripper killed. Now, there was a serial killer on the loose in England, and there was a suspicious pattern of the murders in that they coincided with the towns where Joy Division was playing. The band, Hookie, and Stephen Morris were even questioned by police. Now, the real story is that Joy Division could only get gigs at the shittiest clubs in the worst part of town that they visited,
Yeah,
including
wow.
the red light districts.
Yeah.
And
And
it
all the
just-
women saw their shows and then killed themselves.
I thought
Well,
you were
just
gonna
so-
dateline us. Just that.
And so, with all these gigs in the red light districts, it just so happened that they were near where the Yorkshire Ripper was killing prostitutes. So, add that onto the happy train here. And with that note, we want to thank each and every one of you.
Wow.
We're so appreciative to be able to spend an hour a week with all of you chatting about these 1001 albums. And if you're looking for your own unknown pleasure, I want to invite you to join our mailing list. It only takes a couple seconds, and it's a great and free way to help support the show. We'll keep you up to date with the occasional email about upcoming episodes, listener polls, show ideas. We promise no spam. So just head over to the episode notes and click the Join Our Mailing List link.
I love the shoehorning in of you want your own unknown pleasure. Wait, do you have a disorder where you love getting spam emails? Yeah.
Are you the saddest person you know? All right, Andrew, this is probably a good spot if you want to stop GarageBand, and then
I'm gonna
you
grab
know,
beer while we do that then.
yeah, you could stop it, save it, and then restart the John.
Also, you got like a waterfall in your garage or something.
Is that
like
is that? Can you hear that? Is that really loud?
It's pretty loud, yeah.
Oh shit. Okay, it's my kids in the shower. One of my kids in the shower. I'm
Oh.
gonna have them cut it short.
I'll have a,
We can
We
just
have a
wait
filter.
5 minutes or something. It's fine.
well, you have two girls, so it might be an hour.
One already showered, and the other one
yeah,
needs
right.
to like. Yeah, hold on for a second.
Yeah. Stop your shower. She's like got like shampoo in her hair. I hate you, Dad. You ruined my life.
Oh, good job predicting she has her phone in there.
Yeah, right.
I'm a terrible parent who's not letting my kid get a phone until high school.
Good
Nice.
for you. They'll be much
Um,
adjusted, I think.
Save.
Adam, just while we have a second, are you gonna?
Yeah.
Do you see yourself doing the 2024 Rex, or do you think that's off the table for you?
Yes, I meant to mention it. Lake Street Dive. They have a 2024 release.
I think the format of the show I'm asking for is 2. Do you think you can
Oh,
come up
got
with
it.
a second
Sorry.
one sometime in the next 6 weeks?
Yes, absolutely.
Then I'll find a spot on the schedule for you. Then I'm just trying to figure out who, and then like make the schedule accordingly.
Got it. Yeah, I apologize for not
No problem.
actually responding to you.
It's a lot going on.
Indeed.
And same question to Tom, actually.
What's up now?
Or do you see yourself doing the 2024 Rex thing, or do you want to just skip it?
You know what? Actually, I can do it. Yeah, I am on like a mailing list of this guy that sends out weekly emails with modern music recommendations, and I haven't listened to a bunch of them, but I can dive into that and find some good ones. So I can do it.
Okay, awesome. Then I'm gonna pop it onto our schedule for both you and Adam. We're just gonna do one at a time, tagged onto the end of a regular taping that you're already coming to. All right.
Nice. Yeah.
And
Cool.
basically, so get them ready sooner rather than later, and I'll send them to me maybe, and I'll compile them, all that kind of stuff. And the ask
Cool.
for that week will be 2 tracks from each on a playlist, and then the listeners will listen to that.
Cool.
Got it.
All right.
All right. Andrew, are you back up and recording file 2?
I'm gonna actually press play this time because we're a little behind on the last one. I apologize. I may need to do some things in post, but I'm gonna click
Oh, no, I
record
can-
right now.
If you just send it over, it'll be fine. It doesn't have to. Like I have a master reference track where I hear everybody's
Oh, okay. Then
as well as my own isolated. So I'll be able to reline yours up just for the file.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
I am definitely recording, and I have no need for a metronome. So
Excellent.
Cool.
oh, it's so much better. Okay.
All right. So when we last left the band, they were heading into Strawberry Studios, a studio that had been recently used by Paul McCartney to record his 1978 album London Town, which sounds a ton like this.
I was gonna say Strawberry Studios sounds so twee and lovely.
Yeah, really.
They recorded it where? So Joy Division records the album over the course of 3 weekends, one to record the music, one to record vocals, and one to mix.
What about the one to wear black turtlenecks and smoke cigarettes?
Now, all told, it's 18 months from the time they release their EP, An Ideal for Living, to the time that they release this album, which has been described as neo-goth rock. Now, the band doesn't like the album at the start. In fact, they kind of hate it. They don't think it represents them or what they actually sound like. Martin Hannett has his hands all over this album with strange sound effects, odd production techniques, and Hannett does not have a ton of confidence in anyone but Ian, as he called the band, quote, one genius and 3 Manchester United fans.
So, what? Okay. Before he got to it, it sounded like an ABBA record.
I guess he had a lot of. I mean, Hannett seemed to have a lot of disdain, maybe for the whole band, maybe just Hook, because Hook seems like kind of a heel. But I guess Hook said like the band's on the left and Hannett's on the right, and if they said anything like, "Hey, the guitars are a little quiet," he'd scream like, "Oh my God, why don't you just f off?" And they then like shout things like, "Do it again, but more Cocktail Party, more Yellow," like all these like weird like, "Do it faster but slower." Like, wait, hold on.
Whoa,
sounds insane.
Sounds like he's pulling from the Brian Eno Oblique Strategies deck.
Seriously. Now, Adam, maybe you can shed some light on this. I saw in a documentary that he demanded that the drums were all recorded with absolute separation, and it kind of sounded like he demanded that they were sort of like recorded separately from even each other.
Yep.
So was the drummer literally just like, I'm just doing the kick drum take now, and I'm just doing the tom take now?
Oh.
Yeah. So
that explains why it sounds like a crappy drum machine, even though it's a real guy. I'm serious.
Yeah. So
and Stephen Morris is known for his actual like metronomic timing. Like he actually is a really, really good, drummer in the pocket drummer like that. But that was not.
But it doesn't sound off time. It just sounds a little devoid of life. But I thought that was more of an aesthetic choice. But if you're recording each drum individually, that's kind of what you're going to get.
He wanted absolute separation so that he could affect them as he wanted. And when I read that as well, it reminded me of our Lenny Kravitz episode, Let Love Rule, because for that episode, I watched a documentary with a studio engineer named Richard Kaplan from 2014. And he had done work in the Motown studios in the late 60s and early 70s. And he said that was standard fare. So the drummer would literally sit down, hold sticks, and air drum while just hitting the kick drum with his foot. And they would record the entire song. He'd put on headphones, he'd come back, remove everything but air, play along, and then do the hi-hats, and then come back and do the snare. So that's why a lot of the Motown drumming has this like super clean sound, because they didn't want that bleed.
Interesting. I will say that a lot of the time on this album, they do not have live band energy at all. And I think that probably accounts for that. But there are times where I feel like they achieve live band energy. And if they are achieving live band energy under those constraints, that is an achievement. Absolutely. Because that's about as artificial as you can possibly get.
Right. So Hannett mixes the album at night because he doesn't want any input from the band. He even goes so far as to add keyboards to some of the songs without telling the band.
Hold on. You're telling me this was recorded during the daylight?
Well, it was mixed on one weekend. So maybe he wanted to do his stuff when they weren't there.
Ian Curtis is knocking on the studio door at 7 a.m.
with his cup of coffee. Let's go. Sounds like
You
me
got, you
starting
gotta
the episode
understand,
off.
Rob. It's like in a casino. There's like a layer of grime on the windows, so you can't actually tell
Yeah.
what the
You don't know
day
what
like
day it is or if
outside.
it even is day at that point.
Yeah.
Good point. Yeah.
So Hooky, the bass player, said, "We hated it. Me and Bernard wanted it to be so much more rocky. I felt Martin had robbed us of our power. It was drained and weedy." And I know I joked a little bit about the production in my tweet, but here's some fun little production notes because I know that this album is, people rave about it for its production. It did use one of the first digital delays on the market, an AMS DMX 1580S. And so he would put the drums through there to get some of the weird delayed stuff. And he was able, again, to isolate so he could do it on just a single piece of the drum or just a single instrument.
You could argue that this is setting the tone for the 80s, which I know none of us particularly love that sound, but I think a lot of these were kind of forefront techniques for what was about to come for this decade of new wave and synth wave and all this other stuff, goth music.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, in my notes, in my general impression, said it sounds way more 80s than it does 70s.
Mhm.
And that is certainly an achievement coming out in 1979 and being ahead of its time and certainly influencing a lot of stuff downstream. I wanted to put in the counterpoint to Adam, your comment about how people have praised this production. I know a lot of people in like the punk community hated the production as well and thought that it was way overproduced and
Way overdone. Interesting. Okay.
Dead Kennedy song "Nazi Punks Fuck Off." Like literally the spoken intro is "Fuck Off," overproduced by Martin Hannett, take 4, and then they like kick in.
Dude, that's crazy. Wow. Nice pull. All right. Tom gets the obscure pull reference for the night. Well done. All right. So this album is officially released on June 15th of 1979.
Sorry, can we talk more about the gear? Are we going to go back into gear
Yeah.
because it's a good gear spot?
Yeah,
Because
go for it.
I read a little bit about the AMS DMX, which is great, 1580. Martin Hannett actually may have had a hand in the creation of that. I guess he knew a couple of former aerospace engineers from Burnley, maybe. Oh, yeah. Mark Crabtree and Stuart Nivison, to name drop. And he would meet them like in, 76 and 77. They'd meet in like an obscure parking lot somewhere. And he would describe sounds he heard in his head. And then they would go and try to create a unit that would actually mimic that. And that's like what the vocals on She Lost Control are going through that. Much of the drums are going through it. Those
I assume
whooshing
that
sounds.
the vocals on "She Lost Control" were through the can with a string.
Yeah, exactly.
He sung
To
through
a pub
Victrola.
from a pub across the street or something like that.
Yeah.
And like those whooshing sounds that that
Those are
happen on
cool.
Disorder,
Those are
that
cool.
is all. But again, stuff that like, the band came back and they're like, I don't think we actually made any of this. And
Did we do
Martin
it?
did with all of his. And I mean, there's like a whole. It's funny you said the only about the effects and like the revolutionary recording tactics. It's like, do you mean reverb? Because apparently there were 2 EMT 140 plate reverbs. This was good. The Marshall time modulator, which Peter Hook referred to as the Marshall time waster, an Eventide H910, another AMS DM220 tape phase simulator, and a Mellows tape echo.
I mean, can you
So
imagine?
reverb, tape echo.
Can you imagine coming in the day after he finished mixing and you remember what you played and you sit down and there's like space lasers and keyboards and weird sound effects? Like, I would love to have been a fly on that wall and to look at their faces as to what they were hearing.
And you're like a punk band who doesn't even have a tuner, and you come in with just like instrument and chord, and he's got this like NASA setup, and he's like, "Oh boy, this is gonna be great."
I took your album to the future, and then
this was developed by rocket scientists. How punk is that?
Right. It turns out, it seems like I'm learning that what I really like is this producer's work. So clearly I am not punk.
All right, so now in order to round out our story, I'll just give a little info on how things came crashing down around Ian and the band. So Ian is sinking deeper and deeper into depression. He has an affair with a woman who still claims that it was all platonic. In March of 1980, they start recording their second album, but Ian's seizures are getting worse and more frequent. At one point while recording the second album, Ian had disappeared for a while, and Hooky found him unconscious in the bathroom after he had a fit and had smashed his head on a sink. So the band does get an opportunity to head to the US for a tour, including an opening slot for a band called the Stranglers. Now, there was a lot of trepidation from Ian about heading to the US, so much so that he actually attempted suicide once by overdosing on phenobarbital, which is one of his seizure medications. Now, he fails to kill himself, but he does leave a note declaring his love for his mistress.
Ooh,
yeah,
that's gotta
rough.
sting.
Yeah. During one of their live shows that was leading up to the US tour, one of the lighting technicians turned on a strobe light, and that sent Ian into a fit, and he winds up crashing into the drum kit. And they carry him off stage and they end the show early. Around the same time, Debbie, Ian's wife, starts divorce proceedings. And
Probably because of that love note to the mistress.
yeah,
It's gotta be tough.
It was weird near the end where Debbie absolutely knew what was going on with the mistress, and they would actually like see each other and talk to each other at gigs. It seemed very odd.
Mm.
They kind of called the mistress the muse. Like she would go on these small local tours with them while Debbie, the wife, who was a nurse, stayed at home. It was really, really messy.
This is a semi-serious question, but I've always seen those warnings for epileptics, you know, that there's going to be flashing lights on TV shows. But can people who have this problem like go to any live concert event? Because I feel like a lot of it is that.
That's a great question.
Good question.
I don't know if you could get some kind of glasses that filter out something. You're right. That
Yeah,
would be, man.
it's a really
Or if you
common
can, or if
thing
you can
to
take some
happen at
sort
a
of
show.
pre-medication that'll protect you or something. I don't know.
Maybe.
Right.
Yeah.
With her first gig lined up in America, which is supposed to be on May 23rd of 1980, Ian's life is quite literally falling apart. And on May 18th, 1980, just a couple days before they're supposed to leave for their USA tour, Ian goes to the house that he and his wife still share, despite the pending divorce. His wife, Debbie, is at work. Ian drinks some whiskey, some coffee, and watches a movie called Stroschek by Werner Herzog, which is about a German street musician who was released from prison, moves to rural Wisconsin to escape his life's problems. But of course, his problems don't go away. And while the character doesn't explicitly kill himself in the movie, it's heavily suggestive of that. So Ian watches this movie. He then listens to Iggy Pop's The Idiot. And then sometime overnight, that night, he hangs himself in the kitchen at just 23 years old. So
Dude, that's all super messed up and super sad. And not to get down and like, you know, kick a guy when he's down, but also super inconsiderate to do it in the home of your wife that you're divorcing and make her come home to find that. That's got to be one of the most traumatizing things that could possibly happen to an individual. And I mean, I'm not going to speculate as to the man's motivations for that, but I'm sure she probably walked in and was just like, what the fuck? Like on many levels, what the fuck, you know?
yeah.
It does speak to the importance, though, in terms of the band, and we kind of touched on earlier about how, you know, 2 records, which weren't, you know, by some people's standards, super impressive, but the fact that Ian Curtis is sort of this icon of both mental illness and other neurological disorders like epilepsy, where they did not have the treatments at the time. And, you know, and Tom, I totally agree. Completely inconsiderate. I mean, I don't know if the kid was not at home, but obviously you are a child who grows up knowing that like this is the path your parent took.
Yeah. And the kid could have come home. You don't know that kind of stuff, you know, like, yeah.
Yeah. So, but in some ways, that's kind of why I think the band also is so important to stand as to kind of bring that awareness back and again for mental illness. And I don't know,
yeah, clearly he was not in a great place and not thinking clearly about it. It wasn't a calculated thing or anything like that. It's just like that little, it just seems like so.
Although I did read that either Bernard or Hook said like, man, I guess we didn't really like when we listened to like really look back at his lyrics, like, man, he was really, really sad. I'm like, you have to look back at that. Like you didn't notice that in real time. It's right out there. It's all on the table. How, you know, the kind of despair he was going through, I think, throughout the course of his, you know, especially once epilepsy kicked in.
Yeah, there's not a lot of veiledness to these lyrics in terms of the fact that he is unhappy and depressed.
And speaking of depressing, what do you say we get into some songs from our focus list?